Become a master chef. Don't just follow recipes. Welcome back to the Juiced Up podcast here. This is going to be a little bit different. We're going solo today. We don't got my partner in Nard. I wanted to go solo podcast today. You can tell I got a nice stack of books here. Just kind of some things that I've been thinking about, as well as kind of some impacts from these books here. I'll dive deep in that in a little bit here. But just like some thought processes I've had, I figured it'd just make more sense if I go solo here, just because they're kind of my thought processes about how I go with training and kind of just life in general too. So yeah, that's kind of what we're gonna do here. We got four books here. Three of them are training related, and then one is non-training related. But I think it's a book that like everyone should read. It was really eye-opening to me. All of these I finished except for the one I'm going through, but it's a sequel to the first one here. So the first one is we have How We Learn to Move by Rob Gray. We'll be pulling a little bit from that. We got Learning to Optimize Movement. So this is the sequel to this first one. This first book like completely opened my eyes to training in just a different capacity. So really excited to dive deeper into this one. Then we got Force, the biomechanics of training. I told this to Hannah, my wife, the other day. Like, I think I learned way more in this book, and it's like 150 something pages. I think learned more in this than I did like my 4 years studying exercise science. But anyways, conversation for another day. And then this last one is Creative Act, A Way of Being. And this is probably a book that I would not have read like even probably a year ago. It's about a music producer. He works with like I think he worked with Adele and Jay-Z. Don't fact check me on that. Rick Rubin is his name. But this one just is like really cool because I've kind of definitely dove deeper into just like being creative. Just realized table is very wobbly. We'll work on that. Just like trying to be more creative with obviously training. Like that's like my creativity aspect. Like I love experimenting different types of like movement and stuff, but also just like really trying to tap into that side of life as well. So yeah, this was just an eye-opening book. I'm not necessarily going to do a book review on any of these. I mean, maybe that could be a podcast for another day. These are more so just to kind of show some thought processes where I'm pulling from. And then I also listened to a really good podcast the other day with John Quint from Westside Barbell and then Dr. Andreas Spinoza. I'm probably messing that up, but it was about just like how to utilize FRC principles, functional range conditioning. If you guys aren't familiar with that, I highly recommend just kind of like go check that out. But yeah, that was a good podcast. I'll definitely be pulling from that. And then like for the Instagram clips, those will mostly be the podcast for that. And yes, that's kind of like what this episode's gonna be like. Kind of just like dealing with or I guess like explaining some thought processes I have. For example, the main two things that I'll probably talk about today is we got my thing or my problem with like labeling best exercises and then just creating an environment where athletes feel comfortable, or even just like if you're training with a group of friends, like create that environment where everyone can kind of just be vulnerable with one another and like like a safe space in a sense. So we got that. But before we dive into that, I'm going to kind of give a little life update. So been dealing with some shoulder discomfort, so that hasn't been fun. About 2 weeks ago, I was benching at we've been going to the local park district gym. So we've been going to that. It's been cool just to kind of like switch things up a little bit. But the one thing I hate about that is the way the benches are set up. They're so narrow. And so like when you're getting set up into your bench press, like it's hard to actually pin your scaps in. Like I just feel like my shoulders are so loose. And I was going through a bench program where the volume is just kind of like waving, but everything's like 85% or higher. And this is like the second time that I've done this. I never had an issue with it the first time around, upper body wise, but when I did it lower body wise for squats, like my knee just started to give out like crazy. Like I've never had knee pain when I squat until I started doing that. And whatever, I'm not going to blame the program. It's probably something I was not doing on that, I guess there, but But yeah, so I was benching like probably a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, and probably didn't warm up like I should have. Didn't really hit my cars and whatnot. But yeah, I was benching and it just like felt a weird, like at first it felt like my pec, almost like a pec minor, but now it's more so it's definitely like feels like a slap tear almost in the shoulder. But I've been training around it, like still been benching, just going a little bit shorter range of motion. But I think the point of that is like it kind of shows like where if you don't kind of train in a holistic fashion, and we'll talk a little bit more this throughout, but just focusing on training internally first before you train externally, like what's going on inside of your body first before you start to train with external loads, like it shows that like it's gonna come up on you in some capacity, right? Like I preach mobility and just like moving good to a lot of my athletes, but like especially being removed now from sport and being removed from like training where you don't necessarily like are training for performance. I want to just be able to train for a long time, right? So like I really needed to focus on just kind of getting that back in. So it was almost like an eye opener for me. I've added in a lot more specific, like getting in deeper ranges. My max effort days have just turned into like heavy overhead pressing and just really trying to load that tissue overhead. So that was kind of, this has been kind of an interesting journey to go down that. What else? What else? Running journey. Oh yes, I started running. Did the lunge 365 last year, and that was really cool. Just to like have something that you're doing every single day. Like mentally, I was in just like the best shape of my life. I feel like it was right after I did 75 hard. I just wanted something to like stay consistent because I loved the principles of 75 hard, but I just didn't really think it was like sustainable. Like I enjoy having a beer with some buddies or enjoy having a nice, cocktail with my wife at home or something like that. But so I didn't want to have to like be so constricted, but I definitely wanted to have something more like focused. And so that was the lunges, and then kind of got like, I don't know, I was like bored of that. Didn't really like feel like I wanted to go more. So then I started running, and at first it was like I was going to run X amount of miles per day, and I was gassed by day three. Like I was like, holy crap, this is hard. So then I kind of switched to I'm going to hit an X amount of miles per week. So right now we're at 12 miles a week. But on top of that, I've been trying to do a 30-minute outdoor workout every single day, which has been great. Really has it like provides me that time where it's just like me. It's like my time in a sense. Like I think there's a time and a place to obviously be always serving others and serving, making sure that we're being a good person and helping others out. But like you need that time for yourself to kind of disconnect. So for me, it's like I try to do it first thing in the morning. Get outside, don't look at my phone or anything like that. Sometimes I'll throw a podcast in, but a lot of times I'm just like going outside and just, you know, letting my thoughts come. And that's been really cool. So some days it's just like a 30-minute walk. Other days I'm doing the run. So like for today, I'm filming this on Wednesday. So Wednesdays are my longer distance runs. So like last week I went first week I did like a 3 miler, and then I've been trying to progressively overload it over time. Last week I did 6 miles, a little pressed for time this morning, so I did 4.5. But yeah, I've actually like I think I used to hate on running a lot, but I've actually really enjoyed running. I think it's just kind of a cool little something cool to dive into. But yeah, and then lastly, in-season program. Guys that are starting up your season, if you're listening to this still and you haven't gotten your in-season program, shoot me a DM at Grant_Lala on Instagram, or just follow me. That'd be cool too. Um, but yeah, I posted a 5-week in-season program. Shoot me a DM, or if you want to just follow it off, I put a swipe carousel. You can follow it off there as well. But if you want like an actual copy, I'll send you an email. Every exercise is linked on there and growing the YouTube page. So they're all like either my self training or my athletes training. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, that's kind of what has been going on recently. So with that, let's get into the podcast. Let's get juicy here. So for number one, I talked about this a little bit in the intro, but we're going to go with the problem I have with the best exercise. I'm actually going to pull two parts from this book, The Creative Act. I told you it's not related to training, but it's kind of cool how you can see some parallels. So the first one we got, be aware of the assumption that the way you work is the best way simply because it's the way you've done it before. And then secondly, we've got, no matter what tools you use to create, the true instrument is you. And both of those, I think, speak a lot of things, obviously. But to keep it in this kind of realm, I think the problem that I have with labeling things as best, whether that be an exercise, a drill, a jump variation, a sprint, like whatever it may be, the problem with labeling as best is you're kind of missing the point of what an exercise is. And John Quint covers this really well in a podcast that I talked about in the beginning. Exercises are just stimuluses, right? Like they're just stimuluses to get our body to either adapt or make some sort of change over time. So if we're only saying like this is the best bench exercise, bench press is the best for throwing velocity. Well, I agree with that. It's kind of a closed-minded view because you're just like, okay, now if you tell that to an untrained athlete or an inexperienced person in the weight room, now they're like, okay, pressing exercises, bench press best, need to do it. And you're missing out on a ton of different variations where it's like this concept that because we labeled this exercise as best, it's just kind of limiting our brain. It's limiting our ability to be creative, right? Like I think again, kind of going back to my shoulder issue I've been dealing with, like that's allowed me to be really creative now because I can't really get a full range of motion bench press, at least at a heavy load without my shoulder flaring up. So like now I need to find different ways to do that. And I think when you kind of come to that realization, oh, all right, sorry about that. Had a little phone call, so we're back here. But yeah, I think where we left off was kind of just saying how when you confine yourself to one exercise as being the best, one exercise as being the end all be all, it's like you limit yourself from the actual movement. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with that and just recognize that exercises are just tools, right? Like I know it sounds cheesy and cliche, but like having a lot of tools in your toolbox. And I think about this with like spinal flexion work, right? So spinal flexion is coming down this way. A lot of people will think of a deadlift as being like your spinal flexion. But like if you're only doing that, like there's probably going to be some other things going on because again, you're not looking at that internal capacity, right? Like how does my spine actually move before I start to load it with weight? And then another point that Dr. Andreo Spinoza, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the doctor of the FRC guy makes is just kind of like upgrading your rehab in a sense of like, is your exercises progressively overloading over time, right? So again, if we're only looking at one exercise, another problem with that is like, are we progressively overloading that, or are we just doing the same exercise over time and not actually adding variations, right? Because it's like if we do the same thing over and over again, we're eventually going to reach that plateau. So it's like we need a variety of stimuluses for our body to actually see progress. And if we look at, I'm gonna pull it out here with the book, How We Learn to Move. This was a big thing that he talks about is repetition without repetition. So he's taking a guy doing a hammer over and over again. And even though the movement looks the same, each time the actual, when you look at it internally, like there's different variations going on, right? Like maybe he's hitting it slightly here versus slightly here. And it's just showing that like when you try to hone people into one movement, you try to get them really good at something, well, that's not even what's actually happening because there's always going to be a slight variation, right? So it's like you look at the back squat. If I'm trying to tell my athlete to sit back more in the heels, like if I'm trying to just hone him in on that movement, obviously you want to have a correct way of doing it, but like understand that every athlete's going to be slightly different. Maybe he doesn't have the capacity to actually get down into a deep squat, so you got to shorten the range of motion. And that's kind of like that progressive overload where instead of only worrying about the back squat and like how much weight we're putting on the bar, maybe the progressive overload is just kind of going down in range of motion, right? So understanding that each movement and how athletes are going to respond differently is a very big kind of key takeaway to recognize when looking at exercise selection. And I think some people might think like, because I'm saying that there's no such thing as the best exercise, that exercise selection doesn't matter. And like, that's not the correlation, right? Working with like the baseball population, so many baseball players just have weak hips or just a weak ability to rotate effectively. And so obviously our training should kind of be tailored in that way. But that doesn't mean that because we're tailoring our training in that way, that there's one exercise that's going to fix that. So I hope that that can kind of show that while there's no such thing as a best exercise, exercise selection is still important. And the point of having a wide variety of tools is so that you can plug in those exercise selections where you see fit. Again, in How We Learn to Move, he talks about how um, movements don't occur in a vacuum. But it's just like that observability bias when we look back on that best exercise and how there is no best exercise. I think when coaches are looking at their session, right, and it's like they're only seeing what they can see, right? So it's like you look at a power clean that they talk about this in the force book, and the focus is all about triple extension. But then when you look at the actual power outputs, like the power outputs aren't even that high in triple extension, right? So it's like we think that because athletes doing a power clean, they're becoming more explosive. We need to get more triple extended, yada, yada, yada. But it's like that's what we see. What's actually going on inside is completely different. So it's like, as a coach, being able to take that step back, whether it's taking that step back and letting your athletes have more freedom, taking that step back and understanding that there is no best exercise, but that there's just a variety of exercise selections that you can pull from. I think that's kind of when you can start to really see progress with your athletes, right? And so, kind of relating this to my last point of creating that environment where the athlete feels comfortable. I think when you can create that relationship, whether it's coach to athlete to athlete, or just friend to friend training together, or just in life in general, like with your coworkers or your colleagues, like when you recognize that there's no one that's better at anything, but there's people that are just trying to always improve upon stuff, right? And so one of the things that I've kind of changed my mind about recently is because I don't know, it's just like this idea of that the coach should always be the one in charge. The coach should always be the one telling the athlete what to do. And it's like, I think it kind of goes back to that perspective of like, if I'm telling an athlete that this is the best way to do something, and they're like, coach, like, I'm not feeling it, I'm not getting the same response out of it, then you've lost that relationship. And I think there's a difference between an athlete just not wanting to do the work versus like actually being honest with you and telling you that like what's going on is not working. But again, you have to kind of come back to that essential point of being like, did we create this relationship where I'm humble enough as a coach where I allow an athlete to come to me and be like, this isn't working. Can we switch it up? Like, or me just listening to them. I think that's a big thing that a lot of coaches and especially like strength coaches, because we're so like masculine looking, whatever, and ego driven, it's like we don't actually listen to our athletes. Like there's so many sessions that I can think of where things were just not going well. And the athlete kind of just like almost took over the session because like we've just obviously developed that relationship, but like when you kind of let that athlete guide the session in a sense, you almost just become a spectator as a coach. And I think that's going to probably rub some people the wrong way because it's like, well, the athletes are paying you money, like you should be coaching them. Yeah, of course. There's a difference between just being on your phone the whole time and not coaching versus like giving the athlete the audacity, I guess that's the right word, audacity? I don't know. The freedom to go experience and go kind of try some things out. Like stick with your program, but like be okay if like an athlete or if you have something planned out on your sheet, like be okay with kind of going off of that. Like I'm thinking about this from I think it was just even yesterday's session, right? Like I had programmed our jump block and we like spent way so long or we spent a lot of time on our jump block because guys were competing, guys were having fun. I'm not going to cut that short to make sure that we can get our back squats in or our box squats or our deadlift or whatever the main movement is that day. Like if guys are enjoying something that you're giving to them, like let it keep going. Um, it's like you don't have to be so confined to your time block sometimes. Like sometimes you might not get to the end. That's okay. Like hopefully you have other training sessions throughout the week where you can just kind of plug those back in. So like almost be okay to create that environment as a coach, as an athlete, or just like again, create a healthy workspace for people to be able to come to you and voice your opinions. And again, I think that's just a hard thing for people to understand because it's like we want to be the one telling someone what to do because that makes us look like we have an authoritative role. That makes us look like we have something worthwhile and worth saying. And there's a difference between like just kind of like being so far removed where it's just chaos. But then there's also a difference between having a respect factor between you and your peers or your athletes or whoever it may be, where because you've developed that relationship, they have the freedom to come to you and just be honest with you. Because there's so many times where it's like athletes are coming to you, and it's like the last thing they want to care about is the workout. Maybe it's some life things that are going on, right? Where some things are like going on at school or going on at the home life. Like you should be there with them as a coach too. Like you should kind of know those things where it's not just all about X, Y, and Z in the weight room. Like have some feel to actually relate with your athletes outside. And a really cool analogy that this book, Learning to Optimize Movement, talked about was in his preface, whatever. He kind of he explained how, where was it? I'm going to pull from right here. It says, becoming an elite mover is all about establishing, maintaining, and growing the relationship between the athlete and their environment. And I think you can take environment as either a physical person or just like the environment the athlete's in. And then I thought this was really cool. Is he related it to marriage? So he said a good marriage is not something one person can possess for themselves. And I think you even hear that sometimes, like I have a good marriage. Like no, you don't have a good marriage. You and your partner. Gosh, dude. There we go. All right. You and your partner have a good marriage, right? Like because I mean, I can speak to this now too. Like being married, like it's not one person. It's two becoming one. Like that's how marriage is designed, two becoming one, and it's those people building each other up that, as a whole, the marriage becomes better, right? And so it says here, you need to relate to your partner, not just have a relationship. Relate is a verb, dynamic and changing, demonstrated through doing, not relationship, now a static state. And so I think sometimes this relationship between athlete coach, it becomes that now, where it's just coach telling athlete what to do, not relationship. Like, hey, how's it going, man? How are we doing today? Are you feeling all right with this? Like, it's like if we could just even ask those simple questions with our athletes or simple questions to just the people we work with, like whether you're in a role of leadership or a role of just like um, where you're, I guess, hierarchy above someone, like how do you treat those people that are on the lower end? Because it's like now as a coach, like I was there as an athlete, so like I understand like how I felt as an athlete when I just felt like the coach was shoving information down me. It's like it's not that marriage analogy where it's people building each other up, because the best teams are the ones that build each other up. Like you look at the best kind of coaches or teams with the best coaches of all time, it's like the coaches are giving their players the praise, saying how the players are the ones that created the organization or created it to be good. And then the players are saying that's the coach that created the standard. And it's like that is a working unanimous team where it's like the coach or the players are feeding off the environment that the coach created. And in return, the coach trusts the players because they're feeding off that environment. So it's like that big kind of circle of like having that relationship with the coaches or having that relationship between athlete and coach. I just love that marriage analogy. I think it makes so much sense. And I think when coaches can start to understand that like a good foundational relationship between coach and athlete is not authoritarian. Obviously, you need to be respectful or you need to get respected by your players. But I think the best way to do that is just relate with them and like don't shove things down their throat. Don't be like, look at what I did back in my day, because it's like, well, back in your day, like you're not there anymore. Like I hate when coaches said that as an athlete. And so that's something that I'm really trying to work on. I don't think it's been a huge problem with me because I'm not like a very like vocal person. Like I don't like to yell at my athletes. Like I like to be stern with them. But I don't like to like yell in their face. Like I don't respond to that well as a player, and so I don't really. Sometimes a coach or a player athlete needs that, but I don't know, man. Like that's just not really who I am. So yeah, that's kind of been something I've worked on. But yeah, so I guess to kind of wrap everything up here, like be able to your goal as a coach is to eventually be able to let those, and I've talked about this before, let those athletes move on where they don't need you anymore. Obviously, you want them to be there as a resource. Like you want to be there as a resource for them. And hopefully, like you develop a friendship over time. But it's like when I send guys off to college, like I don't want them to feel like they have to text me all the time, like, hey, what do I need to do? And what workouts should I do? Is that blah blah blah. Like that hopefully that we've done enough stuff now where they can have that selection of exercises that they can pull from where they feel good, where it's like they can do pregame and they know it's going to get them ready. Like that's what you want as a coach. That's what you want with your athletes. Like you want that working relationship. You want that good marriage relationship, right? So it's understanding that your job as a coach should be less about saying which exercise is the best and instead, how can my athletes become better movers, better movement solvers with the stuff that I throw at them? Because you want them to be adaptable. That's the whole point of sport. Like, how can you adapt in the game? Because things are not, again, movement does not occur in a vacuum. Things are not always going to be perfect. And I think if you look at that in the sport, that's way evident than just a weight room. Like, things are always and constantly changing, right? So, like, how can I get myself to be the best movement solver rather than the best, just like really good at this exercise? That was a lot. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I know it was a little bit different. Next time we'll have Nard back on. And I think we have a special guest coming too. Thank you guys for listening to this podcast. If you guys have any questions about the books that I pulled from, or if you're in the Chicagoland area and you just want to read these books, I'd be more than happy to lend them to you. So reach out. But yeah, thank you all for listening. And always stay juicy.